Hey everybody, it's Mrs. Mancuso doing a little AP Bio review. I want to talk about evolution, and I especially want to talk about natural selection and how populations change over time. So I'm not really looking at like an individual change. Individual change could be like a mutation, but it really doesn't get passed on unless it is in the gamete. So I want to talk about how do populations change over time. And when I'm talking about changing over time, I'm really talking about my P's and my Q's. How does the frequency of my dominant alleles and my recessive alleles change? So we can think of these little guys. They're called rock pocket mice. And if you ever get the chance to go to Arizona, you can definitely see them. And there's areas of the desert. And it's really pretty geographically separated. There's areas where the old lava causes the sand to be extremely dark. And there's other areas where the sand is extremely light. And so rock pocket mice can be born with two different allele frequencies. So we'll say the big A is dark and the little a is light. And so rock pocket mice can be dark or light. And obviously the ones that are on the dark sand tend to have a really increased frequency of the dark allele. Because if you blend in with the dark, you're not going to get caught by the birds and you're not going to die. And the light one is going to have a really high frequency of the little a. And so this is natural selection, survival of the fittest. So based on your environment, there are selection pressures. And those pressures cause a change in the allele frequency of the population. This population has a much higher frequency of A. So I could say maybe P is 0.9 and Q is only 0.1 for this population in the dark sand. Whereas in the light sand, the P might be 0.1 and the Q might be 0.9. These are the selection pressures, the environment that it's in. So you survive where you blend in, where you're not caught, where you're not eaten. Now, let's talk about speciation. Speciation is how you end up getting two species from one. Or if it's adaptive radiation, I think of the finches when I think of adaptive radiation. So adaptive radiation, you start off with one common ancestor and you actually end up with multiple different species. And that happened with the finches because there were many different environments. When I think about this, these two populations of rock pocket mice, if I want to know if they're the same species or not, here's my rule. If you are the same species, what do you have to be able to do? You have to be able to mate. That's the first requirement. Then you have to be able to produce viable, fertile offspring. So you have to come together and mate. You have to have babies. The babies have to live and the babies have to be fertile, meaning that they can reproduce. So if I take these two populations of rock pocket mice and I bring them back together and they do not mate, that means that they have been reproductively isolated. There are 5 different prezygotic isolating mechanisms. So that means ways that they could be separated and not mate. So they're not meeting this first criteria. So the first reason, geographic. They're not in the same location. The second reason, temporal. Maybe living in these two areas, maybe one of the populations tends to mate early morning and another one tends to mate at dusk. Well, they're not going to find each other as mating partners if they don't mate at the same time. So temporal is all about timing. 3 is behavioral. Maybe the behaviors have changed because each one is adjusting and changing in their new environment. And so maybe the behaviors change for recognizing and choosing a mate. Sexual selection pressures may be different. Another one is mechanical. That means if their genitalia have actually changed and they no longer actually come together, that's mechanical. Or the last one is gametic. And gametic is if the sperm doesn't recognize the eggs. So all of these are basically ways that these populations have become different species. They no longer meet that first criteria of mating. Now, if they can mate, then what you are mating or what you are producing is called a hybrid. And so we have postzygotic. So postzygotic means they actually mated and they made a zygote. So these are postzygotic isolating mechanisms. So what could happen with a hybrid that shows that they really are not the same species anymore? My hybrid could be inviable. That means every time they mate, they never end up having living babies. So they really are two different species if they can't have all parts of my definition. So the first, the prezygotic, was it wasn't meeting this criteria. The postzygotic is it's not meeting this criteria. So the next one, my hybrids might be sterile. If they can't produce babies, then they are truly two different species, my two things that I crossed. Or the last one is called hybrid breakdown. Hybrid breakdown is when maybe it worked for one generation, but each future generation has lower chances of survival or fertility. And so over time you realize, you know what, they are just not making it as a species, so they must have been two individual species, the dark and the light. If they are completely separated by these post or prezygotic isolating mechanisms, you have two different populations. All right, so let's talk a little bit about adaptations. Adaptations are what make every species unique. These are what have evolved to make you the most fit. So to be fit in your area, you have to have something that is leading to your reproductive success. If it doesn't lead to you having babies, then you're not really going to see it in future generations. So we always have to talk about a population and what's making it more fit. So if we think about animals, there are so many things that you can think of as adaptations, like maybe having claws or having great eyesight or being able to blend in. And the list could go on and on and on of all these super great adaptations. Most of them are due to a mutation. So mutations aren't really always bad things. They are sometimes things that really help bring about a trait that allows something to survive. If we think about plants, if you had to write a free response about evolution of plants, I would go right for the C4 or the CAM. Both of these plants have PEP carboxylase. PEP carboxylase is an amazing enzyme that's able to fix CO2, and it does not do photorespiration. It does not screw up. Rubisco tends to fix oxygen when oxygen's in high concentration. PEP carboxylase doesn't. So the fact that it can fix CO2 even when it's in low concentration and bring it to a bundle sheath cell or change it into malic acid and store it all night, those are great evolutionary advantages of plants. Another evolutionary adaptation for a plant is its color. They're able to absorb different wavelengths of light. So if you're a green plant, that means you reflect green. That means you absorb all the other colors. So as long as your photosystems for the light reaction can absorb light, you're going to be able to excite electrons and make NADPH and build up a gradient and make ATP. So you're going to be able to survive and do photosynthesis. If you're red, then you are reflecting red. So maybe you're absorbing green. So plants in an area might be able to absorb different wavelengths of light, and what you absorb or what you use or your role in that environment, that's your niche. So all of evolution really ties into all different units because it really shows the possibilities of what organisms can do and how they interact with each other. All right, thanks for joining me.